So we're going to talk about two more very important audio effects in this video, dynamic compression and reverb. So let's talk about dynamic compression first. And before you have a chance to get any misconceptions here, when we're talking about compression here, it's not like MP3 compression or zip compression or something like that. It's not compressing the storage space of something. It's compressing the dynamic range of something, the difference between the softest sounds and the loudest sounds in your audio. So we want to reduce that difference. And the reason you might want to do this is, well, there's many reasons, but one of them has to do with, something might sound beautiful if you have extreme differences between loud and soft when you're listening on incredible speakers in a studio like the one I'm sitting in right now. But think about how people actually then listen to that music in the real world. They're listening on crappy earbuds. They're listening on really junky speakers, like the built-in speaker on their cell phone or something like that. And they're listening in environments where there's a lot of background noise, when they're on the subway, when they're driving, when they're at the gym, all these different places. In all those environments, if there's too much of a difference between your loud and your soft, those soft sounds are going to get lost. Either that or the person's going to be constantly using the volume control to adjust things up and down, up and down. They're going to get really annoyed at having to do that. And so we have a tendency to want to reduce that range in a lot of contexts so that there's not so much difference between loud and soft. There's other reasons we might want to do that as well, but that's one of the most common ones. And so there's a bunch of different tools we can use to do that. What dynamic compression does is it actually takes your louder sounds and it reduces the volume on them. So it brings everything down, and then it can boost everything up afterwards. Limiting would do the opposite. It increases the gain on everything, and then kind of gently limits the loudest things from distorting. And then a gate is another approach, which says if something gets below a certain threshold, I'm just going to turn it into silence. So you can get rid of maybe some noise that's inherent in a recording or something like that. But we're just going to talk about compression in this course. Once you've learned that, the other two are fairly easy to pick up as well. So we can think about it in this way. If I draw a response diagram here that has maybe decibels on both axes. Now our x-axis is kind of decibels in, and our y-axis is decibels out. Normally, this would just be a linear, y equals x kind of thing. But what we get with dynamic compression is up to a certain point, it stays linear, so the input and the output are identical. And then after that, it kind of, the slope gets lower. So after this cutoff point there, the slope of that response gets lower, because it starts bringing down the volume of things as we get louder and louder. And so as we think about the different parameters for dynamic compression, the first one here, this threshold, is this point right here. Above what loudness do we start compressing the dynamic range? The second one is the ratio. So what is the difference between this y equals x slope and this reduced slope of this new line that we're drawing? And then the attack and release times are really about how quickly, when we get above that threshold, does it kick in? That's the attack time. And how quickly after we get below that threshold does it kind of kick out and go back to the original sound. And these are usually specified in milliseconds. And the reason for using them is that if we didn't have these, if we had a sound that was kind of constantly going back and forth around that threshold, we could end up getting some weird artifacts as the compression is cutting in and out, over and over again really quickly. So I want to go ahead and show you how this works briefly in Reaper. I took the liberty, before I started recording this video, of recording a sound that deliberately had too extreme of a dynamic range.
Loud and soft.
So you can barely hear me saying the and soft there. So my goal here is to make the and soft sound much louder. So I'll again go back to this Cocos section of my effects, and I'm going to go down to re-xcomp here. This is actually a multi-band compressor that lets me put different compressors in different frequency ranges. For right now, I'm just going to use it as a single band compressor that has one compressor that applies to all my frequency ranges. And you can see here,
loud and soft.
So that's my original sound. I'm going to set up a threshold here. I'm going to lower this threshold, which is represented by that red line. And then I'm going to increase my compression ratio. I'm going to put it up to something ridiculously high here, just so you can hear the effects of it.
Loud and soft.
So you hear how and soft got much louder. If I increase the ratio even more,
Loud and soft.
then that's incredibly different. Again, just to review, if I bypass this, I hear the original sound one more time.
Loud and soft.
Versus once I've applied the compression.
Loud and soft.
One important thing I want to point out here is this auto makeup gain checkbox. That's because, remember, what I'm doing is I'm reducing the loudness of the louder sounds in my audio. So if I don't have this on, everything's going to get very quiet.
Loud and soft.
Which probably isn't what I want. I don't want to reduce the volume of everything ultimately. I want to just compress the dynamic range. So this auto makeup gain will then kind of automatically boost everything up. It'll automatically normalize everything back to an appropriate level. So that's how dynamic range compression works. And the second thing I want to talk about in this video is a reverb. And to talk about reverb, I want to go back to that drawing that I made when we were talking about binaural sound, where we had your head and your right ear and your left ear and your nose, just to show you where you're facing. And we had a sound source. And in the binaural spatialization drawing, I was showing how this was going to each of your ears differently. In different ways, you're traveling to your different ears, and you're picking up on the interaural delay time and the head-related transfer function to figure out where the sound was coming from. That's what spatialization is about. When we're talking about reverb, on the other hand, we don't care about where the sound is coming from, but we care about our perception of the space in which that sound exists. And so what we pick up on, so I'm going to kind of draw a box here to represent that space. And so what we're picking up on when we listen to reverb is not the delay between something arriving at our two ears so much as all the different versions of the waveform that arrive at us via different paths. Because sure, one goes to that ear that way, but then one's going to bounce off that wall and come that way, and one's going to bounce off here and come that way, and one's going to go all the way over there and come back that way, and so on and so forth. If we look at the sum of all of these, each of these waves is going to arrive at our ears at a different time because they have different distances to travel. And also, each of them is going to sound a little bit different because as they bounce off of all these different surfaces in the room, some of their frequency content is going to get absorbed. Some of their energy is going to get absorbed. So their loudnesses are going to be different, and also their frequency responses may be different. And so this is what reverb is about, is trying to understand how this sound behaves in space. And in the context of an effect that we would add to a track or to a master track, what reverb is trying to do is simulate the effect of a sound in a particular space. Say you recorded a sound in a very dry recording studio, the walls were super absorptive and there wasn't a lot of a sense of the space it was recorded in. Then we want to add in later a sense of what that particular space might be. There are a ton of different ways to implement reverb in effects to simulate this sense of a sound being in space. I want to talk about one today, which is through the notion of an impulse response. The way an impulse response works, a real one, is that you go into a space, a cathedral or a bathroom or a classroom or wherever it might be, wherever you want to capture this reverb from. And you take a starter's pistol or a balloon, or even just clap your hands like that to generate some kind of basic noise burst, basically. And then you record the response of that. What happens? How long does it take for that sound to die out, and how does it change as it's dying out? So this is a real impulse response that was recorded in a real space. A pretty reverberant space at that. It takes a long time for that one impulse to completely die out. And then what I do with that is I take that sound and I combine it with the audio on my track. And I do that in a way that is a little bit similar to how we were talking about filters and delays in the last video, in that I essentially look at this waveform here of my impulse response as a bunch of taps into a mega filter, a mega delay unit. So basically, at sample 0, I have a certain amplitude value, so that's my multiplier. At sample 1, I have another amplitude value, so that's my next multiplier, and so on and so on and so forth. And so every sample on my audio track would have to get multiplied by all of these. That's an incredibly time-intensive process. If I have something like this is about a 10-second impulse response, 44,100 samples per second, that's a lot of multiplies I have to do for every sample. So it turns out that this can be much more efficient to do if I do a fast Fourier transform. I do this all in the frequency domain through a process called convolution. So I want to show you how this works. And then I'm also going to show you how we can fake these impulse responses to achieve similar effects without actually having to go out into space to record a sound. So I'm going to come back to Reaper here. I'm going to delete my compressor. And I'm going to add in, and this is such a horrible pun that the folks at Cocos did, so I apologize on their behalf. The name of the reverb plugin here is called Reverb, R-E-A for Reaper. It's again in this Cocos folder in the effects. So I double click on that and I get my reverb in. And I'm going to go ahead, let's just review what the dry file sounds like again here. I'm going to go ahead, that's the dry sound without any reverb on it. I'm going to add a file reverb. And the file I'm going to add is that impulse response I just played for you. Here it is. And you can see it represented visually here. It's a stereo file, so you get a left and right channel. And then I simply play it back. Hear how long it takes to die out after I stop playback. It's still going, I think. And it's as simple as that. I've taken this impulse response that I've recorded in a real space. In this case, this was under a Creative Commons license taken from freesound.org. And I convolve that with the audio on my tracks to get the reverb effect. Now, there are other ways to do reverb, too, like I mentioned. If you don't want to go out and record a real impulse response, you can simulate this. So here's a simulated impulse response. It's the same basic idea, but I'm setting the parameters of this through parameters like room size and dampening, how much of the wall is absorbing or reflecting sound, and things like that, so that I generate this impulse response through an algorithm, and then I can use that. It's a very different kind of space that we're simulating in that example. So that's the basics of how reverb works, and at least one way to implement it. We've covered a number of basic effects. There's, of course, infinitely many effects out there. But with this foundation about how to use them in Reaper and how some of them work, I think that you should be able to read the documentation for just about any effect and understand how to use it in a musical and meaningful way. So what we've covered here in this particular unit, again, is dynamics processing and simulating acoustical space through reverb. We have one more topic we need to cover in this module, which is once we've finished creating a piece of music in a DAW like Reaper, how do we actually share that in a format that other people that might not have Reaper or our particular DAW can use?